There used to be a roundabout here. It was part of a really interchange between the M1 and the A50, which was hastily put together with the intention of being a temporary junction and layout. After only 20 years, in 2018, extensive works was carried out, resulting in an even larger interchange, and it was these changes that led to the removal of the roundabout and a complete reshuffle of the road layout. Today I'm taking a look at the A50 that runs for about 40 miles, connecting the M1 at junction 24A to the A500 in Stoke-on-Trent. Yes, there is more of the A50 than that, but reasons. Bear with me, because whilst the A50 has been around in one way, shape or form for decades, the A50 that we're looking at today was built between 1985 and 1999, yet despite the excessive construction time, it's a poorly thought out mismatch of different ideas born from the cancellation of a motorway building project. Originally, it was going to be built as the M64 motorway, which would have linked the M1 and the M6 motorways, and that sounds like a great idea. But in the early 1970s, during the planning phase, the oil crisis happened and all of the money for road building was deleted, so that was the end of that. Once things had settled down a bit, several years later, they reapproached the idea of a connecting road between the M1 and the M6, but they didn't really have any money, so a patchwork of A roads was decided to be the best approach, finally finished in 1999. Well, sort of. You could say that it was actually finished in 2018, which brings us back to the interchange and the missing roundabout. When the A50 was finished for the first time, the layout of the M1 junction was supposed to be temporary, with it being built properly at a later stage when funding became available, which it did just 20 years later. Essentially, the roundabout allowed one to get to the M1 south when driving along the A50. But its placement was stupid because you also had the M1 depositing some of its traffic onto the same roundabout, and this caused massive tailbacks. The junction was finally fixed. I say fixed, altered in 2018, which saw the roundabout removed, and access from the A50 to the M1 South is now via a separate slip road, which works better, but not great. Let's move up to the next junction on the A50, where we find the leftovers of another missing roundabout. From the M1 to here, the A50 borrowed its alignment from what used to be the A6, as seen on this old map, and the roundabout was nothing to do with the A50, rather the A6, until it was replaced by the junction we see today. At the roundabout, we'd have found the A6 and the A453, which both have surviving stubs of road coming off the roundabout, never to see a car again. And whilst there's no trace of it today, there used to be a service station situated here, complete with a Little Chef restaurant. The Little Chef opened in the early 1970s, but when the A50 came along, it was forced to close. However, as part of the A50's planning permissions, provisions had to be made for another service station to replace it, which was built a short distance away at Shardlow. It's the only service station that was factored in when building the A50, and it was most likely an idea that came from the old M64 motorway plans. In 2001, the site operators Welcome Break decided to open 2 Little Chefs at the location, replacing the branch that was forced to close, but they only managed to survive for about 5 years before closing in 2006. It's an interesting services, actually. Being Welcome Break's smallest site, it's received the least amount of investment over the years, and indeed there are still some signs in the shape and colour of Welcome Break's previous branding, which started in the 1990s. Fascinating stuff if you're a service station nerd. The next junction along is the Aston Interchange, a lovely trumpet interchange that sadly is completely pointless. After using the interchange, you'll head down a short stretch of dual carriageway to then slam into a roundabout. However, I don't think that was meant to be the plan. The problem is the Alveston bypass section of the A6. When the A50 opened with its trumpet and dual carriageway spur, it didn't exist, so I suspect the roundabout was put in place temporarily, and when the time came, it would be upgraded and connected to the Alveston bypass correctly. However, when the time did come, the Alveston bypass was built as cheaply as possible, meaning there was no room for upgrades or other such nonsense. We'll just chuck it all onto the same roundabout and call it a day. And now the roundabout just gets in the way for no reason. Junction 4 is a large roundabout junction between the A50 and the A38, better known as Toyota Island because of the massive Toyota manufacturing plant that's situated here. Up until this point, we've been enjoying the Derby Southern bypass section of the A50, and if it wasn't for Toyota, there's a very strong chance that they wouldn't have bothered. Before the A50 and Toyota came along, the road layout in the area consisted of the A38. That's about it. But the local council, desperate for any sort of industry to move to the area, promised Toyota that if they set up their factory there, they'd build a new road and junction to make their lives easier. Toyota liked the sound of that and established their factory in 1989. 3 years after, the council opened the A516. 6 years after, they opened a section of the A50 leading up to the A516. But the actual useful part that Toyota were interested in wouldn't be delivered until 1997, with the opening of the Derby Southern section of the A50, featuring a large roundabout junction, as well as their own dedicated slip road access from the A50. They got there eventually. Interestingly, because the council kept f***ing about so much, they ended up building a temporary junction off the A38 to keep Toyota happy whilst they sorted out the A50. It was a small trumpet-style junction of which there's nothing left today, except for this bridge, which was retained and reused. Originally, it would have carried the carriageway over the A38 to a roundabout where you could have accessed Toyota's entrance. The next junction along, Junction 5, marks the start of the Foston, Hatton, Hilton bypass section of the A50, and when it opened in 1995, it was arguably a pointless stretch of dual carriageway because the only other section of A50 to exist at that time had been built 10 years earlier in 1985, running from Blythe Bridge to Uttoxeter. But the two sections weren't connected. A couple of years later, the Derby Southern section was built, and then the Doveridge bypass section, completing the route as we know it. But my God, what a palaver. Junction 5 is also the point at which the junction numbers end. Yes, there are more junctions, but numbered they are not. I assume this is the result of different ideas being applied to different sections of the road. And speaking of, we're moving on to the last section to open in 1998, the Doveridge bypass, known mostly for its concrete road surface that is so loud. Even before it opens, the Highways Agency paid for certain residents to have double glazing fitted. That didn't stop the protests and the petitions after opening, though. To some, the noise was unbearable, but, you know, nothing happened. Eventually, it will be replaced, but only once the concrete reaches the end of its lifespan, probably about 20 years from now. Whilst you may now be deaf, your eyes will still work, and you can use those to spot the Dove Bridge crossing over the River Dove just after Doveridge. It's definitely old. How old isn't exactly clear, but it's believed that some parts of the structure date back to the 15th century. It remained in use as the main road until the mid-1970s, when a new bridge was built to replace it, which in turn was replaced when the A50 was built. Well, I say it was replaced. Another bridge was built alongside it, and each bridge is used for a separate carriageway. From there, we head on to the Uttoxeter bypass section of the A50, which is interesting because it is in some senses the oldest part of the road, having been first planned way back in 1937. While short in length, the Uttoxeter bypass was to be built as a dual carriageway running from the Dove Bridge to the other side of Uttoxeter, but they got distracted somewhat in 1939, resulting in the road opening as a single carriageway, with all of the work done to add the second carriageway at a later date, which I believe was at some time in the mid-1950s. This stretch of dual carriageway was then incorporated into the more modern A50, so when you drive along it, you're using a 1930s designed dual carriageway. A peculiarity is found a short distance away where if you're driving west on the A50, you can exit into a services, but there's no way for you to rejoin the A50 to continue your journey. Actually, that's not true, but we'll come back to that. What used to be here next to the services was a roundabout with some tiny slip roads that would have allowed you access back onto the A50, and that's fine, but this junction had a bit of a flaw in its design in as much as the exit slip road served both the services entrance and the roundabout, and this no doubt led to merging and weaving traffic all over the place. So how do you rejoin the A50 if you come off at the services? Well, now you have to drive up to a newly built junction a short distance away. To be fair, it's better than the silly roundabout thing, but a hassle if you don't realise and you thought you'd just nip into the services for a quick coffee. The junction was added in 2017 simply because they wanted to build a load of houses in the area, and the crap junctions that were there beforehand weren't going to cut the mustard. You can't build hundreds of houses and expect everyone to use a shitty roundabout. Plus, it's a good excuse to spend someone else's money, isn't it? So a dumbbell junction was built with access to the A50 in all directions, and it's also got a bonus bolt-on roundabout to the side, which will just be awful when the houses are finished, and now more concrete road surface. Yep, horrendous. This next stretch of the A50 is probably the most uneventful. Not a lot happens as we make our way from Uttoxeter to Blythe Bridge, although it is slightly interesting in as much as it was the first stretch of the modern A50 to open in 1985. Given its lack of features, I can see why it was first. It was just easier. But once you reach the end of this section, you slam into a roundabout. Useless. And for 12 years, that's how it was, because it wouldn't be until 1997 that the next section of the A50 would be completed. And whilst it wasn't the final piece of the A50 puzzle, for us on our little journey, it will be as we make our way onto the section of the A50 known as the bit that goes from Blythe Bridge to Queensway. And it's a complete scene change. Before, we were enjoying some lovely open space and countryside, but now the A50 smashes its way into Stoke-on-Trent with absolute zero fucks given, and the road has a feel that's very similar to urban motorways such as the A57M or A167M. Shite. That said, potentially much better than what was there before. Take the mere interchange between the A50 and the A520. It was once a traffic light controlled crossroad and a nightmare during rush hour, but let's bang in a 400-metre long tunnel, send a dual carriageway through it and replace the crossroads on top with a roundabout. Only some houses had to be demolished, but they were all the poor people's houses, so fuck 'em. What with the road being built into a cutting and sitting below ground, you can't see sod all whilst driving along, but they love a footbridge along this section of the A50, and it would seem that no two footbridges are the same, all with interesting designs. The oddest of all surely has to be this one found between the Blurton Road and Heron Cross roundabouts, because it's sort of built into the walls and you walk underneath a road to then walk over a road. As you near the end of the A50, keep an eye out for the Waste Incinerator, one of Stoke's most famous landmarks with its concrete chimney stretching upwards for all to see. You won't miss it. It opened around the same time that the A50 through Stoke did in the late 1990s, and it burns 210,000 tonnes of waste to generate electricity to power 30,000 homes. And I thought it was a lovely way to end the video. Over to you, John, for an outro. That's all from me in the A50, so thank you very much for watching. I hope you liked the video. If you did, there is of course a button specifically for that. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys soon. Take care. Bye-bye.